Good morning, guys, and welcome back to our Week 5 video lecture. This week, April 20th through the 23rd, we will be covering the Cold War and some of the events that followed directly after the conclusion of the Second World War. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So, our first slide for the day. Forming an uneasy peace. Well, during the Second World War, the United States and the Soviet Union obviously fought on the same side in mutual interest to defeat Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan were seen as existential threats, not only to democracy, but to any semblance of a free form of life around the world. So the Soviet Union and the United States, along with numerous other allied nations, bonded together to defeat the Axis. Now, once that war ended, the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union began to show. All right, and that's really what we're going to be talking about this week. So, moving on to our next slide. Germany is partitioned. Before the end of the war, in February of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, along with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, would meet at the Yalta Conference. Now, at this conference, they discussed a number of different policies, but the main policy that was discussed was what to do with the country of Germany. Germany, of course, is blamed for the First World War. We talked about that with the Treaty of Versailles. You can argue whether that was appropriate or not, but the fact of the matter was the Second World War, they do bear the blame for that. They were undoubtedly the aggressor in that conflict, and to have two massive global conflicts originate from roughly the same area in a very short amount of time, something needed to change in that region. And what they decided to do was divide Germany up into 4 different occupation zones. One controlled by Great Britain, another controlled by France, another by the United States, and another by the Soviet Union. Okay. Now, they'd also declared support for self-government and free elections in Eastern Europe. If that doesn't sound a lot like the Soviet Union, that's understandable. Even though these agreements may have been made at Yalta, that doesn't mean they're going to sustain themselves. Okay, moving on to our next slide, the Potsdam Conference. So after Germany was defeated, the Allied leaders convened again in July, this time in Potsdam near Berlin. President Harry S. Truman, again, remember Franklin Roosevelt had died before the end of the Second World War, so Truman is now president. Truman represented the United States. Okay, Churchill, who was later replaced by a new British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, who you can see in the picture there, and Stalin attended. So Stalin is still in control of the Soviet Union and will be until his death. At the Potsdam Conference, the Allied leaders finalized their post-war plans for Germany, including the division of Berlin into occupation zones. That's one of the intricacies of the Cold War that is very complex. Not only is Germany partitioned into 4 separate occupation zones, but the capital city of Berlin is also broken into 4 occupation zones. We're going to talk about some of the conflicts that arise from that decision. Okay, next slide. Soviet experience in World War II. Not to say that anyone's sacrifice is more or less than anyone else's, but it's hard to argue that the Soviets didn't experience a more severe reality of the Second World War than many other nations. The United States and the USSR envisioned Europe's future differently. The United States obviously wants a more democratic system, open and free elections. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, not really interested in that. Well, the USSR, during the conflict, had sustained as many as 20 million Soviet citizens' deaths, as well as 7 million soldiers. And on the graph there, you can see just how massive the loss was for the Soviet Union. It is significant. Now, many were killed or died of disease in German labor camps. while others starved when invading Nazi forces stripped the Soviet countryside of crops, farm animals, equipment, burned their villages, so on and so forth. It was a very, very difficult situation, not only for Soviet citizens, but Soviet soldiers. The damage done to the Soviet Union was total. And that leads us to our next slide. Total war, total destruction. In addition, the Nazis leveled several Soviet cities. Cities like Stalingrad and Kiev were gone. You can see some of the images, especially in the slides coming up. Now, flying into the USSR in 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower said this: "I did not see a house standing between the western borders of the country and Moscow." In essence, every piece of land that the Nazis touched, they destroyed in total. Okay, so the Soviet Union post World War II, you can see in the slides here just how truly total that destruction was. When we looked at images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombs were dropped, they looked a lot like these images, except these images that you're seeing here, there was no atomic bomb dropped. It was just a constant fighting for months and months on end. Brutal, brutal interactions. Okay, next slide. Braving Mother Russia without a coat. As Floridians, we get cold when the weather gets into the 50s or the 40s. In the Soviet Union, during the winter, the temperatures can reach well below zero. And if we look at this image here, we can see from 1941 to 1945, everything from clothing, shoes, and cloth has an immense drop-off in production. So imagine the difficulty in trying to survive in the Soviet Union in the winter months without the very basic necessities. That's going to lead to a much higher death rate than is necessary. And again, a lot of this is due to the total destruction that the Nazis brought on them. All right, next slide. Moscow, Russia in the winter, then and now. And just a couple of side-by-side photos of images from the Soviet Union at that time and today. All right, next slide. Back in the USA. In contrast, the United States suffered comparatively less from the war. Again, it's not to say that someone's sacrifice is greater or less than. Just simply looking at the numbers, however, you have to consider that the Soviets bore a much more significant burden than the United States, at least on the home front, right? The United States during the Second World War lost roughly 290,000 U.S. soldiers, but civilian casualties were virtually nil. And the reason for that is because no fighting other than Pearl Harbor took place on U.S. soil. No American cities were bombed. None of the country's farms and factories were destroyed. Where in contrast, the Soviet Union, as Eisenhower said, was virtually destroyed from their western border all the way to Moscow. That is no small amount of land. The Nazis, what they did to the Soviet Union was horrific. Those are things that the United States just couldn't possibly relate to. And that's not a bad thing. It just shows you how the United States and the Soviet Union are going to have a difficult time agreeing on post-war policies. The war for the United States was one way. It was a completely different way for the Soviet Union. Okay, now where we talked about, again, moving on to the next slide, where we talked about how the Soviet Union had difficulties with production during the war, it was actually the exact inverse here in the United States. The U.S. economy during the Second World War boomed. By 1945, the United States was producing over half the world's total industrial output. Think about that. Half of everything within industrial output is coming from one country, our country, the United States of America. The United States had spent at least $320 billion to finance the war, but I think President Truman said it best when he said this money is to be viewed as an investment in world freedom and world peace. Certainly, this was a cause worth fighting for and worth investing in. All right, and our last slide for the day, the U.S. ends trade with the Soviets. Like the rest of Europe, the Soviet Union wanted aid to help rebuild after the war and asked the United States for a loan. Truman, angered by Stalin's broken promises and disregard of the Yalta agreements, again, free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, he wanted to have a get tough attitude with Stalin and the Soviets in general. Shortly after Germany fell, Truman terminated Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. However, those Lend-Lease shipments would continue on for years with other European countries, but not with the Soviet Union. Stalin would declare these actions as brutal, right, making a bad situation just ever more worse in the Soviet Union. Okay, so that wraps up our video lecture for today. As always, guys, I hope you're well, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you back here tomorrow. Have a great day. Goodbye.